All right.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for our webinar series. Today is Connecting with Community through Curation. And I'm T. Marie King, the Local Voices Network Alabama chapter lead. And I have my partner in not the bad kind of crime, but the good kind, Colleen Butler, um, who has um, who has so graciously helped me in preparing for this because I was probably overthinking it more than I needed to. But thank y'all so much for joining us. And I also want to remind you, July 2nd is our bonus webinar. It'll be a lunch and learn with Herbert Wilkerson, and he'll be talking about being trauma informed in an uncertain society. So I think it's a real good one to join in and listen. I think we're all dealing with so much. We have so much information coming at us, and we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and we're still trying to make sure we're well as our families are well as we do our work and or service. And so please join in and learn how you can be trauma informed in these times. And so let's go ahead and jump in. And Colleen, I just love how you describe the principles. Could you do that part? Do you mind?
I do not mind. So for those of you who have been with us the whole time, you know that this webinar series has basically followed the 4 conversation principles that we use for Local Voices Network conversations. We begin always with grounding in our values and really having an opportunity for people to see the places where they have kind of shared values and kind of focus on this notion of shared humanity and starting from a place of building trust. And then we move into the actual conversation. And in that, as facilitators, we're really hoping that you all can help ground the conversation in people's personal experiences and stories. Our session last week, T. Marie and I got to do together on engaging with discomfort, both your own as a facilitator and kind of knowing and managing your own reactions in the moment, as well as navigating potentially conflict or disagreement between participants. And today we are going to have our final webinar for this series, and we'll be focusing on connection with community. And at Local Voices Network, the way that we do that is through the use of highlights. And so T. Marie is our local lead for all of our curation work that we do at Local Voices Network. And so she'll be talking about both how we pick highlights, what are we looking for when we do highlights, and we'll also be featuring a number of, I think, pretty powerful highlights and how they've been used in our communities today. So that's what we've got in store for you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Colleen. So let's jump on in. So highlights. Highlights assist Local Voices Network in not only furthering our mission, but uplifting the voices across communities. And so when we think about where we are in society presently, I think our highlights help inform what's happening across communities. And not only just across our chapters, but also in other areas. When we started having conversations to see how people were processing how they were experiencing COVID, we kind of broadened our borders a little bit statewide to invite other people who may live in other states to participate in those conversations. And just listening to some of the things people were saying from somebody from Wyoming talked about how their brother was experiencing COVID as a 911 dispatcher. And for me personally, it just hearing it live jumped out to me and said, this has to be a highlight. Because at the time I had not thought about the fact that 911 dispatchers were truly essential workers and really on the front lines. And so just having that piece being broadened and like, wow, I haven't even thought about it from that perspective. And so we want to make sure we are using this to show you that, or show our participants that, this is not, you're not alone. You're not the only one experiencing some of the things you are. It also may highlight that, this is going on in a community that, I have no clue that that thing or that experience is taking place. And so it's an opportunity to truly bring us together. And so we're going to play a couple of highlights for you. And I think this one has quite a few voices on it. So we're going to listen to it and then I'll come back.
just wanted to state that, you know, we just want people to understand when we say Black Lives Matters, it's not saying, I say this all the time, it's not saying that white lives don't matter. It doesn't say that Asian lives don't matter. And we feel like we have to express that all the time. When we say Black Lives Matter, that means we're talking about us right now because we don't get that same treatment. And we need help from everyone to try to make sure justice gets served to people who think that they could just kill us. I mean, really, you know, it doesn't mean that their lives are any less valuable than ours. It just means that there is a drastic change in how things are handled with Black or brown people and Caucasian people. So right now we need the attention on us because we're getting gunned down at a high rate. And we're getting locked up at an even higher rate for petty crimes and for no crimes at all.
Laura was stating that this is a time for us to be grounded and look at different ways. Unfortunately, there are some people who want to go back to the old way, and the old way is why we're here now. You know, it's exactly why we're here now, and we have to change up some of the ways that we're seeing things. And being Black, I was also a little perturbed when 2 days ago, the whole country realized that Black people are at the epicenter of every damn epidemic in this country. This is not news. Like when I started seeing this is being treated, we just found out that Black people are dying more. Well, shit, where you been? You know, we've been known that this is not new. And I'm worried about, you know, my people.
There are things that we know that white supremacy and white oppression did to the minds and psychology of Black people in the city of Birmingham and across the nation. Let's not ignore those realities when we're dealing with the justice system, when we're dealing with you know, housing, lending, all the facets that Black people need to live.
Only hope that I have is to we all just continue to unite. Even with the Floyd issue going on, it saddens me, but what softens my heart and what keeps me from crying about it is that white people are standing with us because they about sick of it too. And that part right there is the hope that, you know, I just want to keep seeing that happen because we all want to see better. You know, at least the people that I sit at the table and eat with, you know. I have in my lifetime felt that I've ran into some people who could care less about me. But I keep coming back to this space right here, and I'm reminded that it's those people they're still sick. Can't do nothing about it. And I just keep being in these healthy spaces, and that's where the hope is coming from, right? So I know that I'm not doing all this for nothing.
So, I mean, it's beautiful to see across states, you know, Wisconsin and Alabama having some of those same shared experiences, frustrations, and also hope. And so that's what a highlight can do. You know, you can add a highlight into a conversation that will not only grab people at their heartstrings, but I think also move people to a space of thinking about, you know, what can I do more, you know, or what more could my community do? And I think the highlights give us an opportunity to grow and expand in that area. And so that's a sample. So we can go to the next slide, Colleen. And so we have a poll that we're going to take. And Colleen, I'll let you handle the poll.
All right, so you can all hopefully see this now, but basically we're just wondering how many of you have signed in to the lvn.org account yet, and how many have actually made some highlights at this point. So just curious how many are kind of familiar with the process. So looks like we've got 4 out of 5 of you have responded. Give you another couple seconds, and then we'll close it out now, I think. So I will go ahead and share the results so you can see we've got one person on the call so far has signed in and made some highlights. And then 3 of you have signed in to your account and I'm assuming kind of poked around and seen your conversation or other conversations, but haven't gone in to actually make highlights yet. So that's just helpful for us to know as we're going through the rest of the material today, what your experience has been so far with the highlighting process as a facilitator.
Good deal. All right. So for those who have actually not made a highlight, we're at a good space in talking about how we're curating highlights for LVN. We'll go to the next slide. And so let's see. One of the things we definitely want to make sure, so we're curating highlights, not just for conversations, but we're also adding them on our social media. So shameless plug, if you haven't followed Local Voices Network on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, please do so because we're sharing a lot of highlights on our social media. But we want to make sure that we're identifying people properly. We want you to know exactly who they are because it helps in context. You know, because a lot of times you'll play on the highlight and it's like, okay, that's good, but you know, where are they from? What do they do? You know, we all have these questions that kind of add that meat around what is being said. And so making sure that we know on this one, Darcy is a white teacher from a Madison public school. You know, that helps give context to what the highlight. So if you hear the highlight and she's talking about students or, you know, it's like, okay, well, who is this person? It helps provide that context. Next slide. And I think this is one that we can play. Mm-hmm. Let's hear this highlight, Colleen.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, my experiences with officers in the schools is that they do everything they can not to arrest kids. Mm-hmm. And they're extremely kind and very, very, very positive role models for kids in the schools. You know, the schools I've worked in, some of the resource officers are people of color, and they're working with students of color, and they're able to see a police officer in a responsible role, being good with kids, being supportive, and so, you know, I know that there's privacy issues and things, but you see these groups of people who like walk through schools like once a year or twice a year, and then they like kind of poke their noses into places here and there, and then they think they can develop an opinion about something, and they couldn't be less informed. So I don't know how to address that really. You know, we've got a big election coming up with, you know, the school council, and we got a big election coming up with the mayor. You know, I'm hoping that, you know, some of these disparities can be addressed in really, really progressive and well thought out and well funded ways.
All right, so that was Darcy from a white teacher in Madison Public Schools. And then what we wanted to do today was also show you like how it impacts people in the conversations to listen to a highlight from somebody from a different perspective in the community. So that highlight was played in this conversation, which was with mostly Black residents in Madison who were part of a group of returning citizens or formerly incarcerated citizens in Madison. And so this is Erin responding to that same highlight that you all just heard. So I'll play this one for you next, just to give you a sense of what the power of the highlight can be in the conversation.
I was listening to the guy, and I actually was listening to his voice, and I totally can hear some of the things he was saying, but I just can't see how that is effective. And the last thing I will share, I remember to this day, like it was yesterday, I remember I was going through a teenager temper tantrum. And I was just I was just out of control, totally. And this is while I was in the institution, but I was a juvenile, and I remember a guy by the name of Bruce. He grabbed me because I was just out of control. He just grabbed me, put his arms around me, and just held me. And I was trying to get away and all of those things. He just didn't let me go. He didn't allow me to hit him or none of the above. Ultimately, I tired myself out and I just cried. But he didn't hurt me. He didn't disrespect me. He didn't belittle me. He allowed me to calm down, and then he started to talk to me. And I say that because to this day, that was an act of love. And it was not an act of disrespect. And so I think when it comes from the family and from the community, it's a better perspective versus as it coming from the police, because police gonna do just that. They gonna police.
And so being able to, hear that perspective brings not only a different vantage point of seeing it, you're also hearing somebody who have had a firsthand experience in it. And a lot of times, we are going through life, we're having our journeys and other people are having theirs. And sometimes we come in at different vantage points. And so what I love about Highlights is that it provides the opportunity for us to see things from somebody else's side. We talk about taking the time to walk a mile in another person's shoes. And I think Highlights absolutely give us that opportunity to do that and empathize with other participants in our conversations. Anything else you want to add to that, Colleen? Or
no, I think, you captured it. I think this first part of our session today, we really wanted folks to have a sense of the power of Highlights and why this is a focus for the way we close our conversations. I know that there have been times in the past where facilitators have, wondered whether they can cut out the highlight. And you can. I mean, if you don't have time or you're having a really rich conversation, you don't need to force it. But I do think one of the power of LVN conversations is bringing in perspectives that people wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to hear. And so we just wanted to kind of lead in with a couple of, I think, pretty good examples of that. And also I'd invite you just to reflect kind of privately. You don't need to share back in the chat or anything like that, but just when you heard different people's voices, who were you personally most inclined to lean into and to listen to, and who maybe, was somebody who was challenging for you to hear their perspective. And I'll turn it over to T. Marie, who's going to talk a little bit more about when we're making highlights, how can we be aware of our own personal kind of preferences and biases.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colleen. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. So I think, it's so important that we think about checking our own bias lens. And, what is a bias? A bias is just a prejudice or judgment in favor of for something, someone, or a particular group that's considered to not be fair. And we all have these, Sometimes it's really hard to acknowledge that we have a personal bias. Bias is the tendency, as I said, to favor one thing over another. I'm in the South, I'm in Alabama. And, around football season, you start seeing the lines being drawn. People start picking their sides. I see car tags that say a house divided because clearly the husband or the spouse is for one team and they're for the other. So those are those fun biases, that we have. Bias is a natural, normal human tendency. We make judgments. That's how we go through life. You might like a hamburger at this particular restaurant, but prefer this other restaurant's fries. It's just a natural tendency that I prefer this over that. And also, most biases are harmless. They're very harmless. It's just our own preferences. I like this. I want to do this. This is what works for me. But we have to be careful that we're not allowing our bias lens to lead us in a way that excludes different groups or people. And so we want to make sure that as you're listening to highlights, you're not necessarily listening for what's familiar. You're not listening for, those voices of things that may just immediately resonate with you because it mirrors your own experience, but being more open to say, you know what, that's totally different from what I know and what I have personally experienced, and seeing what meat you can pull from it that will help uplift that voice, not only to our participants, but whoever may come across our conversations through our social media or through our media posts. And so just thinking about how you see things through your own personal lens and making sure that that's in check when you start highlighting. And what's key with that is our next slide talks about one of those favorite things, the art of listening. Listening is basically at the core, the ability to accurately receive and interpret messages through communication. That's what listening is. Listening is an art that requires work. It's a skill. We all listen. We use these all the time. We're listening, but to truly be engaged, and sometimes what I use the term of deep listening, it takes work. It is a skill that you have to develop. It's almost like building a muscle. You just have to make sure you're working at it. Listening helps in making an emotional connection. I find myself as I'm listening to these highlights that it's like, wow, I can't believe that's going on there. Or, oh my gosh, never thought about that. I did a conversation recently with a group of men here in Birmingham, Alabama. It's an all-Black men's counseling group called Brother Let's Talk. And the things that they were sharing, as a facilitator, we're not, being a part of the conversation, but I kept hearing things that I was like, this has to be a highlight. This has to be a highlight. And even though I'm also Black, but I don't walk through the world as a Black man, it was things that I knew they were experiencing that I didn't necessarily have to experience or what am not privy to. But I'm like, other people need to hear these same comments. So listening helps in making an emotional connection. Also listening, let's see, what's the next one? Listening challenges our assumptions. Sometimes we assume, maybe this is going on in that community, or maybe, this demographic of people, this is how they feel about that. Actually taking the time to truly listen, you might find out, I totally got that wrong, or you know what, I didn't think about that like that. So listening challenges our assumptions. And that in itself helps you clean up your bias lens. But listening also enhances your understanding, and it helps us grow as a community. If we can take the time to understand one another and where we're each coming from, it helps grow that understanding so we can grow and build a better global community. And that's what we're trying to do with these highlights, is provide those opportunities to listen. Listening is a good thing. Let's see, and what's next? And so what's a good highlight from media? And I'm going to pivot this to Colleen, because there's been a lot of good coverage of the work that's being done in Wisconsin.
Great. Yeah, and so, Team Marie was really just covering kind of generally the skills that you all would be using as facilitators to select highlights. And then the second question is like, well, what happens to these highlights? Obviously, you're using them in your conversations, and you can use the ones that you pick, or you can use ones that other people highlight. There's all sorts of ways that you can utilize the highlights. But the other two things that the highlights tend to be used for are for our relationships with our media partners and our social media, as Team Marie mentioned earlier. And I noticed before that we've got Jess on the call as well, who is our kind of social media lead. So Jess, at the end of me talking about media stuff, if you want to jump in, please feel free to do that, to share a little bit. But we've really tried lately to figure out ways to share these voices that are so powerful from the different conversations that we've been having in all sorts of ways, because I'll profess my own bias right now, which is that I really do have a bias for this kind of dialogue being meaningful and impacting the people who are participating in it. So if only the 6 people in a conversation only heard each other, I would still think Local Voices Network was worth it, because I think that what happens in these conversations is meaningful in themselves. But what makes Local Voices Network dialogues a little different than other dialogues is this ability to actually take the voices beyond the 6 people. And so the ways in which we've been doing that is through this pretty concerted effort that, like I said, Jess has been leading for us to be a little bit more robust with our sharing of voices on our channels, and then also through our partnerships with media organizations. So I've got 2 examples for you here in terms of the media highlights and how our media partners have been utilizing them. So in Madison, Wisconsin, our primary partner and our kind of earliest partner for Local Voices Network has been the Cap Times. And so what they did is they had a group of reporters that were trained by us. And so they went through a facilitator training. They also participated in a conversation themselves. And then they have been listening to conversations and writing articles that pull people's voices into their stories. So the one that I have on this slide is one that was actually from last year, even though it seems quite relevant today, on our discussion of Madison's racial disparities. And so this is a picture and the headline. And then on the other side of the slide, you can see the way that the story looks. So they have a story that they're writing about racial disparities, but then they also pulled in the voices of a number of people. So I'll see if I can do this real quick and just share with you this highlight from Riley, who was one of the voices that they shared in the conversation. So they actually embed the highlight in the actual online article. And so if you're somebody who's never heard of LVN and you are listening to or reading the article, you can easily kind of click on it and hear the voice, which I have found that there's something really powerful about hearing people's words in their own voices rather than just reading the transcriptions. And so I'll go ahead and play. This is just one sample. The whole article had a number of different highlights in it. But this is one of the ways it's being used here.
And I think like there are so many things at this university that are actively hostile towards students of color. Like there's that phrase like death by 1,000 paper cuts, and like in the social justice field they often talk about that with microaggressions, but like it extends far beyond microaggressions. It's like environmental, it's everything feels like a hostile space, except for a few safe spaces. Yeah, so it just like makes it really hard to be a student here when you feel like you have to protect yourself at all times.
So I'll just invite you to kind of notice how you're feeling as you listen to that. And, you know, imagine you're scrolling through the Cap Times and reading their article about it, and then you click on it and you hear Riley's story, and then you would hear Nasida's story. And there's a variety of stories in here. And so so this is just one example of what Cap Times has been doing. They also did articles on housing, on the Muslim community, on climate change, and they use the same kind of structure where they did their own reporting, and then they also brought in quotes and embeds of highlights in the reporting. So the next one I'll share is actually an example from T. Marie's main media partner in Alabama, which is AL.com. And so they are fully online kind of news organization, and they have been our kind of main partner as we've launched in Alabama. And so similarly, this particular story is about COVID-19 and the conversations that we were having around COVID-19. And there are a couple of quotes in this particular story that I'll also share with you. But you can see, the story is about COVID-19 generally. And also this particular one is also a little bit about who Local Voices Network is and what we do. And so I'll go ahead and share these highlights with you as well. And it's the same as Cap Times, where they're embedded right into the article. So if you're reading it, you can click and hear people's voices.
I'm very worried about the best actors, honestly. But the existing fragile or lack of services are going away at a time when the most vulnerable people need it. I belong to this group, maybe some of y'all heard of Be a Blessing Birmingham. And so, we're just aware that a lot of food sources are gone. And so we're trying to provide at least a sandwich, sack lunch for dinner and some peanut butter and jelly sandwich for breakfast. But there's just a group of people making sandwiches and going out in their cars and handing it out, just that lack of, and I know the city's doing things, but that lack of infrastructure, it's just, I worry more about people who aren't privileged, honestly, because I've got all kinds of privilege. I've got a job that I can still make money at, and but just seeing the crumbling system in places just give way.
And then there was one other highlight from that conversation, or I'm sorry, from that news article. I'm just going to pull up really quick. And I'll share this story with you as well. And then I'll bring it back to T. Marie to talk about kind of like what are the different things that we should be looking for as we are making highlights. How do we know when something is a good highlight for media or conversation? So we'll come back to that after we listen to this last clip from Tony here.
I just want to warn y'all that I'm a little emotional, so I may cry. It's the happy cry, but the thing that gave me hope immediately was the fact that my boss told us that we could go home and still get paid and not have to work. And that sounds like a sweet deal, and it is, but the work that I do is considered not top tier essential service, but at least mid-tier essential service. We help people who are homeless. We help people who are homeless who live with HIV. We do HIV testing, STI screenings, because you don't want to have COVID and one of those too. And I noticed a lot of my coworkers, everybody has different work ethics. And I have issues with some of my fellow directors because I think they have horrible work ethics. And I've always been told that shit rolls downhill. and it was obvious. Like the first day when we had the discussion, one of the directors was like, well, I've heard some of the people talking about, they're just not going to do anything. They don't want to come in. They want to do this. And these are like social workers. And I'm like, oh shit, like social workers, like this is what y'all doing now. And so when I talk to my people, and I love my staff, I really do. But when I talk to my staff, they all wanted to work. And all we're doing is testing people and trying to make sure people okay. But even I have a young lady who's pregnant on my team, and I just won't let her work because I don't want her to do anything that's gonna endanger herself or the baby. But everybody else on my team has been coming in and working, and they don't have to work. They can get paid and stay the hell at home. But I worked with some amazing people. And it's just amazing to see what things like this can do to bring people up and bring people together. And I think I should talk to my therapist because I hadn't worked this piece out. But it brings me joy. And I'm not crying because it just brings me so much joy because all the shit that's going on right now in this country that we live in, you have people who really, really care. and it means a lot to me. Sorry.
No, you are fine.
You know,
I'll say what I really liked about that highlight, and both of those highlights you played, Colleen, came from the same conversation. And I think it was more tears in that conversation than any other one that I facilitated. But just the humanity, I think connecting through stories, because these were people who all live in Birmingham, but were experiencing COVID from totally different lenses. The work that Lee does, that Tony does, and some of the other people, they're doing great work, but their fields don't necessarily cross paths. And so to hear how they all were experiencing it, and kind of even the charge that they was getting from it, because even after we stopped recording the conversation, I love having people ask, how can we stay in contact with one another, or how can I help you, and so knowing that kind of that it just the in-person conversation prompts that, it makes me just wonder what these highlights can really do for the larger community. And I think it's so important, and I'm gonna let Jess chime in a second. Some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm listening at conversations, whether I'm leading them or other people have led them, I'm thinking, what is that heartstring thing? What is it that pulls on me or tugs on my heart to say, wow, like maybe I need to investigate that more, or I really want to know more about that and what's happening in that community. I'm thinking about what new information am I learning? I shared the story about the highlight from Wyoming of not even thinking about 911 dispatchers being essential workers. That was a surprise to me. I was helping host a conversation yesterday, and this person that was facilitating went in and listened to highlights ahead of time and identified one that he knew fit the folks who were going to participate in his conversation. And the highlight came from a guy who's a friend of mine who participated out of South Dakota and was talking about the poultry industry. And the guy that was leading the conversation, they were dealing with that in their community. And so, if that person from South Dakota had not been involved in the conversation, that highlight never would have been available. And then I'm also listening for solutions. What are other communities doing that's solving problems that maybe other people can hear? So heartstrings, new information, and solutions are things I'm thinking about, but also I'm thinking about, what are the concerns and hopes of others, and do those hopes resonate with others? So those are some of the things I'm looking at as I'm pulling together highlights to share with Jess and our media folks. But I'm gonna pivot to Jess and just allow you to share what you're looking for when curating for social media.
Yeah, thanks, T. Marie and Colleen. So I think that the things that I'm looking for when, I'm curating for social media are very similar and in complete alignment with what you're looking for when you're curating for conversations or when we're curating for media. I think I really like that you shared Tony's story, because the reason that I selected that was exactly the point you made about essential workers, T. Marie, of, I didn't think about what he describes, the perspective of how he describes himself as a mid-tier essential worker. And there being, a perspective that people really haven't heard that was valuable. So for me, I would say the priorities are that it sort of shifts it helps shift a narrative. I think, it provides something different than what we're sort of seeing in mainstream media. And I agree with what you said, T. Marie, about solutions, because one thing that I really don't want to do in our social media, and that I think some organizations, when they share people's voices, are in danger of doing, is is sort of like just telling the story of tragedy. And I think it's really important, especially, you know, when we're having these difficult conversations about race and injustice and, you know, lack of access or challenges around COVID, that we don't want to just propagate the story of tragedy, but of communities finding their own resiliency. So I think that's important. One thing that I will add specifically about social media is that we're sharing these publicly, and we have the responsibility, therefore, of really providing that context, especially if the person is, you know, not identifiable by anything other than, you know, their name in the highlight that you're sharing. You know, social media is a place where people can misuse, you know, content really however they want. And so just in sharing these stories on social media, we really want to be mindful of getting the person's name right, getting their location right, getting, if they talk about their role earlier in the conversation, you know, getting that right. So one thing is that when you share a highlight, either on social media or in you know, traditional media, you're not just sharing that highlight, you're responsible for framing that highlight. And that's more important on social media, I think, than anywhere else, because things can be taken out of context. So that's all I would say. Definitely in line with what you two have said.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. So yeah, you know, so we want to continue to utilize these highlights to further, you know, our mission, but also further community. You know, I think that's at the heart of the work that we are doing, is about furthering community, expanding that, and connecting people across, you know, state lines, city lines, you know. And, you know, I think ultimately we all want to be global, you know, but that's the beauty of media and social media, is that it makes the world so much smaller, you know. So we're definitely, you know, excited and enthused as you all are hosting conversations, as you go in and listen. We want to know what's jumping out at you, you know. And if there's a highlight that you find that you're just like, this right here, everybody needs to hear this, please let us know. Let us know that you came across a highlight from, whether it's your conversation or another conversation you're listening to, and say, you know, I think this needs to be shared with our larger partnership. So please inform us if you see that. Did we have another slide, Colleen? Or are we towards the?
I think we're towards our end here. So yeah, it's just if folks have questions. So I can unmute you all if you would like to jump in, or people can put questions in the chat as well. You don't have to, but this way you can if you'd like to. So we gave you all a lot of information today. So so what questions are coming up for you, or what have been some of the ways in which you've either like enjoyed using highlights, or maybe struggled with creating highlights as you've been facilitating so far?
So this is Natalie with the Cap Times, and I was just wondering if I could take this chance to hear other people's perspectives on what you think might be the most valuable ways for media outlets to use some of these things. Like if there are just any things you'd really like to see being done with some of these highlights.
That's great. Natalie, did you want us as the staff to respond, or were you wondering if other folks on the call would have ideas about that?
I think I'd be really open to anything. I know Max and I have discussed this a bit before, and I've certainly seen the Cap Times previous examples, but I just wondered who might be interested in chiming in if they had ideas.
Great. I'm going to be quiet for a second and see if anybody who's not a staff person wants to jump in, because I get to talk to Natalie offline too, but I can share if nobody else has something that pops up.
Natalie, I promise I was listening, but would you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, I'm a journalist with the Cap Times, but I have not yet used any LVN things in my own work, and I just wondered if anyone on the call had recommendations or thoughts about how they thought would media outlets should best use things like this?
I mean, I have one thought, but I have to admit that I don't know how you do your work, and I'm not speaking of you specifically, but I don't know how media works, you know, the day-to-day operation. But my thought has always been I work up in Wapaka County, and my thought has always been that it would be really great that when there is something going on, that a story is being worked on around a particular topic, I would love to see LVN being used as one of the resources to find out what community members are saying about that particular topic. So maybe there's some big transportation thing going on, in my case, in the county somewhere. And I would love to see our local media use LVN as one of the sources that they go to find out what people are saying about that topic. Because the experiences I've had, and are that there's a lot of interviews and stuff are being done, but a lot of times it's just very easy to go to the people who to only go to the people who are a little more central, rather than trying to figure out what sort of the masses are saying. That's not the right word, but but again, you guys probably already have ways of doing that I just don't know about. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think that in the stories I've seen the Cap Times do so far, they've tended to be more they've tended to be less kind of in that direction, and I think that's a really valuable direction to go, like just how to pull these things into a story that was otherwise already happening, but how to pull in more voices, I think is something to aspire to.
I had a question that was related more to, and then I'll have to go, I'm sorry, after hearing the answer, but that's more related to when LVN doesn't have maybe an official media partner, what are some, in my area, what are some ways that, and maybe this is a conversation with Max, that I can maybe share some highlights with some of my local folks to maybe even just get them interested, a teaser, whatever that might be?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's been something that's been coming up for us a lot more since we've been virtual. I'm sorry, I realized I just jumped in. Did you want to go, T. Marie, or do you want me to keep talking?
Oh, you're good. Go ahead.
All right, sorry. We basically, it is a little bit of a challenge right now, I mean, a good challenge, because we're getting voices from places that we would not otherwise be able to hear from or reach without doing things virtually. But it has kind of caused us to rethink a little bit of our model, because what we had been doing with these more kind of chapter-based locations is developing these relationships with media partners, which obviously works when you are in one place, but when you've got folks participating like T. Marie did from South Dakota and Wyoming, where we don't have partnerships, it's important for us to think about how do those voices get amplified as well. And so I say all that to say it is on our radar as a question. In terms of an answer, what we're trying to do right now, and we definitely can follow up with Max and then reach back out to you, is Max has been creating these bi-weekly digests of highlights. And so when you think about, sharing a teaser, he's been basically looking at all the highlights from each chapter. So right now, for you would be Wisconsin. He could include you on that digest, and you could potentially share that out with folks in your community who might be interested in hearing more and learning more. The other thing is really a focus on more social media. And so, if there are ways that we can partner with you to kind of share the content that Jess has been creating for social media, and share that within your channels as well, I think that has been a really excellent way for more people to get to hear voices and stories.
Thank you. I'd love to see that digest, and I'd be happy to share some things for via social media. With that, I'm gonna have to go. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Bye.
Bye. Any other questions?
I was just going to add to what I think it was Natalie that asked the question, Cap Times. And this is taking the LVN hat off and just regular T. Marie. What a lot of times I follow a lot of news through Twitter. And so what always kind of captures my attention is, you know, those things that I pull up and it just immediately I hear something. I immediately hear a voice. So I'm following Vice News. I'm following Newsy. I'm following outlets like that get me to that human story quicker. And from there, I'm usually, okay, let me investigate that a little bit more. Or I'll tweet, you know, I've tweeted Vice News back before. I'm like, can you give me more information on this particular story or what's going on in this area? So for me, who is I'm a serious Twitter follower for news, you know, those things kind of stick out to me, is pulling it up and hearing a voice or a story immediately. And that usually is what kind of captures my attention.
And do you mean hearing as in actually hearing? Like, are you talking about audio or the broader, just knowing a specific story?
For me, is usually audio. But I like the what is it? Is it Now This? I like those videos that pop up. And even though they're usually not audio, they have the words, kind of like how you saw the words on our highlights, but they're showing pictures. And I'm a very visual person. And so being able to see that and be like, oh, wow, this is going on here, you know, and it'll make me favorite it to go back and get more information later. Great. Awesome. So I know we have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, and T. Marie, I don't know if you have any kind of closing thoughts you want to share, but I do have just a super quick poll, and I can go back to our music from the beginning while you fill it out. It'll be only, you know, should be less than a minute, but we love your feedback on that. But let me turn it back to you, T. Marie, for anything you want to close us out with, and then I can bring up the poll and some music.
Awesome. All I just want to say is thank you all for taking the time to tune in, and thank you to those who probably watch it later. So I appreciate you, and thank y'all for facilitating and, you know, for wanting to be a part of this expansion of community with us. And thank y'all. Colleen?
All right, here comes the poll, and I'll get some music playing in just a